I'd rather I'll just tell you what the book's about, and if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. The book's about three diseases. The book is a combination of short stories that are intertwined and interconnected. It's a nonfiction, so stories you have to take in that context. So the three diseases that the book's about is ADHD, autism, and 22q. There's a chapter on each of these diseases. You're familiar, I'm sure, with ADHD and autism. ADHD is now estimated to be 1 in 10 births in the United States. Autism is estimated to be 1 in 68 births. 22q you probably never heard of, and that's a very serious disease, and it has a Philadelphia background to it. In the 1970s, a doctor named Angelo DeGeorge at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children noticed that children who had congenital heart diseases very often, to a very high percentage, also ended up with ADHD, and he published a paper about it. And at the same time, doctors in Japan were noticing that children who had cleft palates had ADHD, and then other doctors around the country were noticing similar patterns. And at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, they discovered the disease that's related to this whole series of other conditions. And the disease was based upon a genetic mutation in the 22nd chromosome in the Q stem, so they called it 22q. They invented the test at CHOP for determining if you had this disease. So there's a chapter about CHOP. CHOP, you may be familiar with, is an extraordinary hospital, the first pediatric hospital in the United States. It treats 10% of the children in the United States who have rare diseases. So it's a phenomenal place and doesn't get the recognition it deserves. There's a chapter on CHOP. In 2006, CHOP decided that it wanted to get involved in genetics, and it formed a division called the Center for Applied Genomics. And over the past 10 years, that center has grown. There are now 70 scientists there, and they're discovering genetic causes for diseases at the rate of about 1 a month. This doesn't mean they're keeping up with the science, because 200 to 250 rare diseases are discovered every year. In any event, in 2015, President Obama decided to start what he called the Precision Medicine Initiative. And the idea was to try and discover the genetic cause for various diseases. And instead of, when you go to the doctor, getting whatever was the general medicine for that general disease in the dose that was generally recommended, the theory was that you'd set up a pattern where medical treatment would be very individualized. It would be based upon the genetic causes for diseases, and you would get the treatment that related to that genetic cause. So that started in 2015. However, CHOP had been doing it for approximately 10 years by then. And when CHOP set up the Center for Applied Genomics, it hired as the first director, and the fellow is still the director. He's from Iceland. He lives here in Chester County, in Tredyffrin Township. His name is Halkin Arson. He and I have been very good friends since 1992, when his son and my son started kindergarten together. And he is, at this point, probably the leading geneticist in the world. So to bring this story forward, in 2012, he discovered at the Center for Applied Genomics in Philadelphia the genetic cause for a subgroup of the ADHD patients. Approximately 25% of the ADHD patients have a genetic mutation which is in the mGlu genes. I won't go into detail about the genetics, it's described in the book. And he came to me in 2012 when he formed this company and asked if I would help him in going forward with the development of a drug that would compensate for 25% of the ADHD patients' problems. So we formed a virtual company called Neurofix. It's a company that's never had an office, never had an address, never had a telephone number, never had an employee, never had a piece of stationery. But we had this company, and he and I spent 18 months trying to obtain financing to proceed with a clinical trial. There's also a chapter about clinical trials in the book. And we didn't find an investor. It's very difficult to find investments for startup drug companies because the failure rate between a discovery and taking a product to market is 94%. So it's very unlikely that you'll be successful. The average period of time to take a drug to market is 12 years, and the average cost is $280 million. What happened in this case was my next door neighbor, also a very good friend, a fellow named Phil Harper, he decided to invest a couple of $1 million in this little company, and we were able to run a clinical trial. And the clinical trial was dramatically successful. There were 30 ADHD patients, and everyone showed dramatic improvement. And the 3 couples would meet every Sunday night to discuss what was happening in the clinical trial. And the stories of the patients are in the book. I'll just tell you one quick one. There was a patient who had ADHD, of course. They all had ADHD, all 30, and all 30 had the genetic mutation that my friend Halkin had discovered. And all 30 were successful. So this one young man, his parents were very medically savvy. His father was a doctor, his mother was a nurse. And he followed the typical regimen in this clinical trial. He came in on a Saturday morning at 6 o'clock. We ran the clinical trial at Jefferson Hospital, and he was given the first dose of the drug, and then he had to stay in the hospital for 12 hours, and blood tests were run every hour, and this was to ensure that the drug would be safe. And then he would come back on Sunday, and he'd be interviewed to proceed with the trial. And when he was interviewed, he had improved so much from just the first dosage that the initial thought was that maybe he didn't really have ADHD. So they went down and checked the records, and clearly he was diagnosed with ADHD. So he was accepted in the trial, and he was given the first week's batch of pills. What neither he nor his parents knew was that the regimen we were following called for the first week to be a placebo. And a placebo looks like a real pill, but it doesn't have any medical effect. It's just sugar. And he took the placebo for a week, as they all did. And his parents kept calling Halkin, who was running the test, saying, you know, we don't see anything happening. He's even worse, because he, like all the other patients, had to be off the disease the medicine they were taking before the trial began. And Halkin said, you know, just be patient. It takes time for it to take effect. he couldn't tell them that it was a placebo. So they came back the following week and they started on the regular dosage of 50 milligrams the first week, 100 the next week, and so forth. And after 1 week, the parents received a call on a Thursday night, so he was on the drug for another 4 days. And the teacher said, "You have to come to school tomorrow." So they, of course, were very concerned because they were always being called to school because he was always getting into trouble. And they met with the teacher and the principal, and the teacher said, "Something's happened to this kid. He's completely different. He's bringing in his homework. He's quiet in class and he's participating. He's even made some friends, which he's never done before. There's something that's changed and we have to know what it is." And they, of course, told them about the clinical trial. So those were the kind of stories we were hearing from these patients in the trial. And the people at the hospital were starting to notice the difference in these patients who were coming every weekend to be in the clinical trial. So the trial was so successful that we ended up selling the company in September of 2015. And while the 6 of us were out celebrating after the sale of the company, someone said, "Well, someone should write a book about this experience. Here we've been able to affect the lives of potentially millions of people around the world. And since no one volunteered to tell the story, I decided to write the book." So the book is, as was mentioned, Finding the Genetic Cause and Therapy for these 3 diseases. I should mention that the same genetic cause for a subset of the ADHD patients is also the genetic cause for a subset of the autism patients, also approximately 25%, and is the genetic cause for virtually 100% of the 22q patients. I think the market for the book is primarily parents who have children with these diseases, and this is the story of what hopefully the future will hold for those children.